For 10 years, geneticists searched for it. The distinct DNA signature that would define Slavic people. The genetic marker that would prove Poles, Russians, Czechs, Serbs, and Bulgarians descended from a single ancestral population that spread across Eastern Europe carrying a unique bloodline. They analyzed thousands of DNA samples. They compared haplogroups across populations. They built family trees stretching back thousands of years. And they discovered something that contradicted everything textbooks claimed about Slavic origins. There is no Slavic DNA, at least not in the way we thought. The genetic marker most associated with Slavic populations, Y chromosome haplogroup R1a, isn't uniquely Slavic at all. It's pan-Indo European. It appears in Russians and Poles, yes, but also in Persians, Indians, Scandinavians, and ancient steppe nomads. The same genetic lineage spans from Iceland to India. When researchers looked closer, they found sub-branches. Z282 and M458 appear more frequently in Slavic-speaking regions. But these are relatively recent splits, 2,000 to 3,000 years old, not ancient enough to explain Slavic origins. And they're not exclusive to Slavs either. The paradox is profound. Modern Slavic populations, 300 million people speaking related languages across half of Europe, don't share a unique genetic signature that distinguishes them from their neighbors. Poles carry similar DNA to Germans, Ukrainians to Tatars, Serbs to Romanians. If the genes aren't purely Slavic, then what created the Slavs at all? How did one of Europe's largest cultural and linguistic families emerge without a distinct genetic founder population? Tonight, we're solving the mystery that geneticists couldn't crack. The truth about Slavic origins that's hidden not in blood, but in something far more powerful. Genetics can tell us who the Slavs mixed with, but only language reveals how they mixed. And what linguists discovered about Slavic languages rewrites the entire origin story. Proto-Slavic, the ancestral language from which all modern Slavic languages descend, emerged remarkably recently. Linguistic reconstruction places it around 500 to 600 CE. That's astonishingly late. For comparison, Latin had already fractured into early Romance languages by then. Germanic languages had diverged centuries earlier. But Proto-Slavic shows something extraordinary. It's linguistically uniform. When it began spreading across Eastern Europe, it was a single language with minimal dialectal variation. This suggests rapid expansion from a relatively small source population, not gradual evolution from multiple ancient tribal groups. Yet embedded within Slavic languages are words that don't belong. Loanwords from Gothic, the now extinct East Germanic language, terms from Thracian and Illyrian ancient Balkan languages, Iranian vocabulary from steppe nomads, Finnish and Baltic influences in northern dialects. These loanwords aren't random borrowings. They reveal contact and mixing. They prove that as Slavic languages spread, they absorbed populations who spoke other languages. And crucially, those populations didn't just adopt Slavic vocabulary, they became Slavic speakers entirely, abandoning their ancestral languages. Dialectal boundaries tell another story. Modern Slavic language borders often align with ancient tribal territories documented by Roman and Byzantine historians. Polish dialects preserve features from regions where Germanic tribes lived. Bulgarian shows Thracian substrate influences. Ukrainian carries echoes of Iranian-speaking Scythians and Sarmatians. The pattern is clear. Slavic linguistic expansion wasn't genetic replacement. It was cultural transformation. Existing populations, Goths, Thracians, Balts, Finno-Ugric peoples, adopted Slavic speech while maintaining genetic continuity with their ancestral populations. Languages are genetic code written in air, and Slavic linguistic history proves that culture can spread far faster and far more completely than DNA ever could. They left no written chronicles, no recorded kings or empires, but in their pottery, their burial customs, and their DNA lies the seed of every Slav alive today. The story begins not in recorded history but in the European Bronze Age, 2,000 to 3,000 years before the first Slavic languages appeared in texts. Across north-central Europe, from modern Poland through Ukraine into Western Russia, a series of archaeological cultures emerged and evolved. The Lusatian culture, the Trachiniac culture, the corded ware culture. These weren't nations or empires. They were networks of farming communities sharing similar technologies, pottery styles, and burial practices. They built wooden longhouses. They cremated their dead and buried ashes in urns, decorated with geometric patterns. They worshipped household hearth cults and solar symbols that would persist in Slavic folklore for millennia. Modern genetic analysis reveals something remarkable. Populations in these regions show genetic continuity from the Bronze Age into medieval Slavic periods. Ancient DNA from Lusatian culture burials carries haplogroups that appear in modern Polish and Czech populations. Ukrainian Bronze Age samples show genetic links to later medieval populations in the same territories. This means the people who would become Slavs were already there. They weren't invaders arriving from some distant homeland. They were the descendants of Bronze Age farming populations who had lived in Eastern Europe for thousands of years, gradually developing linguistic and cultural patterns that would eventually be recognized as Slavic. But language evolution requires more than just time. It requires specific social conditions. Populations large enough to maintain linguistic stability, yet interconnected enough to share innovations. Isolation creates dialect diversity. Complete mixing homogenizes differences. Proto-Slavic's remarkable uniformity suggests it emerged in a sweet spot, a network of communities in regular contact, but not yet politically unified. The collapse of Roman power in the 4th and 5th centuries CE created exactly those conditions. As Roman administrative structures withdrew from Eastern Europe, local populations filled the vacuum. Bronze Age cultural patterns, dormant under centuries of Roman and Germanic political dominance, re-emerged and spread. When Byzantine chroniclers finally noticed the Slavs expanding westward and southward in the 6th century, they weren't describing a new people appearing from nowhere. They were observing the culmination of a process that had begun millennia earlier in the Bronze Age villages of north-central Europe. What if the peoples historians buried are still living inside our DNA today? What if Gothic warriors, Scythian horsemen, and Thracian farmers never disappeared, they just changed languages? The genetic evidence proves this isn't speculation. It's measurable reality. Consider Poland. Modern Poles carry significant frequencies of haplogroup I1, a lineage strongly associated with ancient Germanic populations, particularly Goths. Archaeological evidence shows Gothic presence in Poland during the Roman period. Then the Goths migrated south and west, seemingly vanishing from Polish territories. But genetic analysis reveals they didn't vanish. They stopped speaking Gothic. The population remained. When Slavic languages spread through the region, Gothic-descended populations adopted them. Their DNA persisted, even as their language was replaced. Modern Poles are partly descended from Goths, who became Slavic culturally, while remaining Germanic genetically. Move east to Ukraine. Ancient DNA studies show that Ukrainian populations carry genetic signatures from Iranian-speaking nomads, the Scythians and Sarmatians, who dominated the steppes for over 1,000 years. Byzantine sources describe Antays and Sklaveni tribes in Ukraine during the 6th and 7th centuries, speaking early Slavic languages. But these populations show genetic continuity with earlier Scythian and Sarmatian groups. The nomads didn't disappear. When Slavic languages arrived, they settled, adopted agriculture and Slavic speech, but maintained genetic connections to their steppe ancestors. In the Balkans, the story repeats. Serbs, Croats, and Bulgarians carry high frequencies of haplogroup I2A, strongly associated with pre-Slavic Balkan populations, like the Thracians and Illyrians. When Slavic languages spread into the Balkans in the 6th and 7th centuries, they encountered these ancient populations. Byzantine chroniclers described massive Slavic migration waves, but genetics reveals a different story. Limited numbers of Slavic speakers arrived. Their language spread through the existing Balkan populations, and the genetic makeup remained predominantly indigenous. Modern Balkan Slavs are mostly descended from pre-Slavic Balkan peoples who adopted Slavic languages and identity. These aren't isolated examples. They're the pattern. Across Eastern Europe, genetic analysis consistently shows that modern Slavic populations are descended primarily from pre-Slavic populations who adopted Slavic languages during the early medieval period. The Goths, Scythians, Thracians, and countless other ancient peoples didn't vanish. They became Slavs. Their tribes didn't die, they changed names. No empire united them. No Caesar led their legions. No organized state directed their expansion. Yet Slavic languages spread across half a continent in just a few centuries. How? Between 400 and 900 CE, Slavic languages underwent one of history's most remarkable expansions. Starting from a relatively small homeland, probably somewhere in the northern Carpathian region or southern Poland, Slavic speech spread to territories stretching from the Elbe River in Germany to the Volga in Russia, from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic and Black Seas. The mechanism wasn't military conquest. Archaeological evidence shows no massive population replacement, no destroyed cities, no evidence of the systematic warfare that accompanied Roman or Arab imperial expansions. Instead, the spread was cultural, what anthropologists call elite dominance, or more accurately, mimetic selection. Slavic-speaking communities offered something that neighboring populations wanted: successful agricultural techniques adapted to northern European climates, egalitarian village governance structures that resisted centralized control, and religious flexibility that allowed syncretism with existing beliefs. As Roman power structures collapsed and Germanic kingdoms fragmented, Slavic-speaking communities expanded not through conquest, but through assimilation. Small groups of Slavic speakers would settle among existing populations. Intermarriage would create bilingual families. Within generations, the entire community would speak Slavic, while maintaining genetic continuity with pre-Slavic ancestors. This process mirrors how Latin spread across Western Europe, not through genetic replacement of Celts and Iberians, but through cultural adoption by populations who became Romans without losing their genetic identity. The difference is that Latin spread through imperial power. Slavic spread through decentralized village networks. Compare this to other linguistic expansions. Arabic spread through Islamic conquest and administrative structures. English spread through colonialism and economic dominance. But Slavic spread without any of these mechanisms, just networks of communities finding Slavic language and culture advantageous enough to adopt voluntarily. The virus analogy is apt. Successful cultural systems spread like beneficial infections. They don't require force if they offer genuine advantages. And in the chaos of post-Roman Europe, Slavic social organization, flexible, egalitarian, agriculturally successful, proved remarkably infectious. The expansion hasn't stopped. The pattern continues today in different forms, as populations continue to adopt cultural systems that offer advantages while maintaining genetic diversity. Millions of people have sent their DNA to commercial testing companies, hoping to discover their Slavic roots. The answers that came back were often wrong. And the reasons why reveal something disturbing about how genetic ancestry is marketed, misunderstood, and manipulated. Here's the problem. Commercial DNA tests don't actually measure ethnicity. They measure genetic similarity to reference populations in company databases. And those reference populations are heavily skewed toward Western European samples because that's where most customers and research funding originated. A Polish person submitting DNA might get results showing Germanic ancestry, not because they're not Polish, but because the database lacks sufficient Polish reference samples and defaults to genetically similar German populations. A Serbian person might receive results indicating Greek or Anatolian ancestry. Again, not because the results are wrong, but because Balkan Slavic populations share significant genetic overlap with pre-Slavic Mediterranean populations, and the database categorizes that similarity using available Mediterranean reference samples. The categories themselves are problematic. What does Slavic mean genetically when we've already established that modern Slavic populations are descended from multiple ancient groups who adopted Slavic languages? Is a Pole with I1 haplogroup markers any less Slavic than one with R1a? Is a Serb with I2a markers less authentically Slavic than a Russian with different lineages? The answer is that genetic testing companies are selling categories that don't reflect biological reality. They're marketing ethnicity as if it's encoded in DNA, when it's actually cultural, linguistic, and historical. Your DNA can tell you about your ancestors' migrations and the populations they mixed with. It cannot tell you what cultural identity they held or what languages they spoke. This isn't just a technical problem, it's been exploited politically. Nationalist movements across Eastern Europe have weaponized genetic data to make claims about population purity and historical territorial rights. They selectively cite genetic studies that support their narratives, while ignoring research showing the complex mixing that actually characterizes all human populations. Respected geneticists like Adam Rutherford and David Reich have warned repeatedly, genetic ancestry doesn't equal ethnic identity. Populations are not frozen in genetic purity. Migration, mixing, and cultural transformation are the historical norm, not the exception. Slavic DNA became a brand, and brands can be manipulated, but the truth revealed through careful scientific analysis, rather than commercial marketing, is far more interesting than any myth of genetic purity could ever be. History is repeating. The next great Slavic expansion is already happening. But this time, it's not about language spreading across tribes. It's about genetics dissolving into something new. Walk through Warsaw, Prague, or Belgrade today, and you'll see what medieval chroniclers saw 1400 years ago. Populations transforming through contact and mixing. Ukrainian refugees integrating into Polish communities. Central Asian migrants settling in Russian cities. Western Europeans moving to Eastern European tech hubs. Modern migration creates the same patterns that formed the Slavs originally. Genetic mixing, combined with cultural exchange, populations adopting new identities, while contributing their own genetic heritage to evolving communities. Demographic research by geneticists like Nina Jablonski shows that human populations are becoming more genetically homogenized in urban centers worldwide. The genetic distinctiveness that once characterized isolated populations is dissolving through intermarriage and migration. This doesn't mean the loss of diversity. It means diversity is being reorganized. Instead of genetic variation existing between populations, it increasingly exists within them. Modern cities are becoming genetic melting pots, where individuals carry ancestry from multiple continents, challenging the very concept of discrete ethnic categories. Will Slavic as a genetic or cultural category persist? The answer is, it will transform just as it did originally. The Bronze Age farmers who became Slavs probably didn't identify as Proto-Slavic. They simply lived, mixed, and gradually developed the languages and cultures that later scholars would categorize as Slavic. Modern Eastern Europeans are undergoing similar transformations. Genetic mixing is creating populations whose ancestry is far more complex than any traditional category can capture. Cultural identities are evolving in ways that blend historical Slavic traditions with global influences. The lesson from Slavic DNA isn't about finding pure origins. It's about recognizing that human populations have always been fluid, always mixing, always transforming. The Slavs didn't emerge from a single ancestral tribe preserving genetic purity. They emerged from multiple ancient populations that found advantages in adopting shared languages and cultural practices while maintaining their diverse genetic heritage. And that process continues today. Maybe the real Slavic legacy isn't what we inherited from Bronze Age farmers or early medieval linguistic communities. Maybe it's our demonstrated talent for becoming something new together, for creating unity through cultural exchange rather than genetic isolation. For centuries, we told the wrong story about Slavic origins. We imagined a single ancestral tribe migrating from some mysterious homeland, conquering territories, and replacing earlier populations with pure Slavic blood. The genetic evidence reveals something far more complex and far more interesting. The Slavs didn't replace earlier populations. They incorporated them. Goths became Poles. Scythians became Ukrainians. Thracians became Serbs. The genetic markers we carry today tell stories not of purity but of transformation. The linguistic evidence confirms this pattern. Slavic languages spread not through conquest, but through cultural adoption, as populations found advantages in joining an expanding network of communities with shared speech. And the lesson extends beyond Slavic history to challenge our entire understanding of ethnicity, ancestry, and identity. Because if modern Slavic populations, 300 million people, united by language and culture, don't share unique genetic origins, then what does that say about other ethnic categories? What does it say about the relationship between biology and culture? It says that the categories we use to divide humanity, racial, ethnic, national, are far more fluid than we pretend. That populations are not frozen in genetic purity but are constantly mixing, transforming, incorporating new influences while maintaining cultural continuity. Your DNA is not your identity. It's a record of your ancestors' journeys and the populations they encountered. It cannot tell you who you are, only where you came from. And if you trace those origins back far enough, you discover that everyone came from migrants, mixers, people who crossed boundaries, and created something new. The Slavic DNA mystery teaches us that there is no pure bloodline. There never was. And the search for genetic authenticity is fundamentally misguided, because authenticity in human populations doesn't mean purity. It means the accumulated mixing of thousands of years of contact between peoples. I want to hear your thoughts about this discovery and what it means for how we understand ethnicity and ancestry. In the comments below, tell me, if you have Slavic heritage, does learning about the complex genetic origins change how you think about your identity? Do you think ethnicity is primarily genetic, cultural, linguistic, or something else entirely? And what does it mean that commercial DNA tests often give misleading results about ethnic ancestry? Because the more we study human genetics, the more we discover that every population we think of as distinct is actually a mixture, that boundaries between groups were always more cultural than biological. That migration, contact, and mixing are the historical norm. The Slavs aren't unique in having complex origins. They're typical. Every population emerged from mixing. Every ethnic category contains genetic diversity that contradicts simple origin stories. Every nationalist myth of pure bloodlines crumbles when subjected to genetic analysis. Your ancestors were travelers, mixers, people who crossed boundaries and created hybrid identities. That's not a flaw in your heritage, it's the fundamental pattern of human history. Thanks for watching.